The radio crackled once, then silence. In the darkness, a voice came through, steady clipped, trained to carry through noise and fear, and the quiet that arrives just before everything goes wrong. Ghost, confirm position. Nothing. The silence stretched. Not the comfortable silence of empty rooms or late nights. This was the silence of held breath, of 6 men waiting in a structure that had been called safe by people who had never stood inside it. Of a woman 30 meters away, crouched behind a crumbled wall, watching the door she had walked out of exactly 4 minutes earlier, because something in the air had shifted, and her body had learned over 25 years to trust that shift before her mind could name it. She confirmed nothing. She watched the door. Then the world inside it came apart. Cut. Fort Holloway, Nevada, 6:14 in the morning. The kind of morning that arrives like an obligation pale dry. The sun not yet committed to showing itself above the ridgeline. The desert here smells of alkali and engine oil and something older underneath both of those things. Something that has no name except the weight of a place where men have been training to kill other men for longer than most of the buildings have been standing. A government-issued Jeep pulled through the main gate and stopped near the edge of the parade ground. The driver didn't speak. The woman in the passenger seat didn't ask him to. She stepped out, 5 feet 3 inches, 119 pounds. Dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who stopped caring about appearances somewhere around year 8 and never found a reason to start again. She wore standard-issue fatigues with no unit patch on the shoulder, no rank visible on the collar. A black duffel bag over one arm. Around her neck, beneath the collar of her jacket, a set of dog tags on a chain slightly longer than regulation. Not her tags. She stood still for a moment and looked at Fort Holloway the way a person looks at a place they have been trying not to think about. The parade ground was already active, junior enlisted, moving in the early morning rhythm of bases, everywhere the shuffle of people with places to be, and the heavier walk of people, still deciding whether they had a reason to go there. The motor pool to the east, the long, low silhouette of the barracks. A shooting range somewhere behind the far fence line, not yet firing, but present the way all ranges are present, a held potential, a breath not yet released. She picked up the duffel and started walking. Her name on paper was Commander Lena Harmon, assigned to Fort Holloway for logistics intelligence support. Temporary duty. Low profile. The assignment existed to be ignored. On paper. What was not on paper? What existed in servers behind encryption levels that most people at Fort Holloway had never needed to think about was the other name. The one used in briefings conducted in rooms without windows by people who never wrote anything down. A call sign that had moved through the community the way certain names move, not loudly but with weight. Passed in the spaces between official language. Confirmed, never acknowledged always. Ghost. She had spent 25 years building that name out of silence and precision and a refusal to be where people expected her to be. 6 teams. 43 missions in theaters that required people who could walk into a place without leaving a footprint. She had outlasted partners and outlasted enemies and outlasted several versions of herself. She was 48 years old and she was tired in a way that sleep did not touch. She wanted, for the first time in her adult life, a morning where nobody needed anything from her that she would have to give with her hands. The base unfolded around her as she walked. She cataloged it the way she cataloged every space she moved through: exits, elevations, patterns of movement, points of cover. Not because she was working, because she had stopped being able to turn it off somewhere around year 12 and had made her peace with that a long time ago. What she noticed first, before the layout, before the faces, before anything tactical, was the texture of the place. The way the junior enlisted moved when a certain set of footsteps came close. The slight recalibration of posture. The eyes that found the ground a half-second too fast. She had seen that texture before. It was the texture of a place where one person had decided that authority and fear were the same instrument. She slowed. Across the parade ground near the equipment shed, a sergeant stood with his back to her. Wide. Heavy through the shoulders. The kind of build that takes up space as a statement. He was speaking to a private who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, and though Lena was too far to hear the words, she could read the geometry without any difficulty. The private's chin was down. The sergeant's voice, though she couldn't make out the content, had the cadence of something that wasn't instruction. It was performance. An audience of 2 corporals, standing slightly behind the sergeant, confirmed it. They were smiling the way people smile when they are grateful the attention is on someone else. Sergeant Dale Voss. She had read the name in the base personnel summary the night before. Not because his name was flagged, because she read every summary before she walked into any space. 25 years of that discipline had become indistinguishable from breathing. She noted him, filed him, kept walking. What she didn't know yet, because no summary would have told her, was that Voss had been the organizing principle of Fort Holloway's informal culture for the better part of 18 months. Not through official power, his rank was unremarkable, his record clean the way certain records are clean because the people writing them were afraid of the conversation. His actual power was simpler and older. He was the largest presence in any room he entered, and he used that presence the way some people use a weapon, not constantly but consistently enough that the threat was always present even when the weapon was holstered. Fort Holloway had learned to organize itself around him. Junior enlisted gave him wide berth. NCOs who might have challenged him had found over months that challenges had consequences, difficult to name in any official report. Even officers with the authority to correct him had developed the habit of noticing something more important to do whenever his voice got loud. He had never been held accountable for any of it. That morning, watching the private with the lowered chin absorb whatever Voss was saying, Corporal Tanner Mercer stood at the sergeant's right shoulder and laughed at the right moments. Mercer was 23. He had attached himself to Voss 6 months after arriving at Holloway with the instinct of a person who has learned that proximity to the dominant force in a room is the easiest form of safety available. He was not cruel by nature. He had simply decided that cruelty navigated correctly was less dangerous than principle. Neither of them noticed the woman crossing the parade ground with the black duffel bag. The administrative building smelled of recycled air and old coffee. A staff sergeant at the front desk gave Lena a visitor badge and pointed her toward a hallway, third door on the left. The colonel was expecting her. The name on the door read Colonel Caldwell Foster, Commanding Officer. She knocked once. Come. Foster was standing behind his desk when she entered, not sitting. He had been moving when she knocked, which told her something about how he used time. He was in his late 50s, with a face that had been rearranged by weather and years into something that communicated experience without having to announce it. Thick gray at the temples, a jaw that belonged to a man who had spent decades making decisions in front of other people. His eyes moved to hers and held there with an attention that was not aggressive, but was not casual either. She handed him the transfer orders. He read them without sitting down. His expression didn't change through most of it, but at the bottom of the page, the name rank full designation. Something moved through his face. Not surprise exactly. More like a recognition that had been half expected and was still in the moment of arriving significant. He set the paper down. Harmon, he said, not a question. Sir, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked slightly past her, or slightly through her in the way of people who are looking at a memory that happens to be wearing someone else's face. I knew your father, he said. Fort Bragg, 87. He was the best I ever trained alongside. Lena kept her face still. That's what people say, sir. Foster looked back at her directly. He seemed to understand that she wasn't being dismissive, that this was simply how she carried it, the weight of a name larger than she was, that she had been walking beside her entire adult life, that she had built her own name in partial response to and in partial flight from. He didn't push on it. Your assignment is logistics intelligence support, he said. Access to the data systems on level 2. Workspace is ready. He paused. Welcome to Fort Holloway, Commander. She nodded, picked up her duffel. She was at the door when he spoke again quietly enough that it might not have been meant to carry. He never threw the first punch either. She stopped. She did not turn around. She stood for exactly 3 seconds with her hand not quite touching the doorframe. Then she walked out. The hallway was empty. She stood in it for a moment, breathing the recycled air. Her left hand had moved to the chain around her neck without her telling it to. She felt the weight of the tags between her fingers, the edges worn smooth from years of the same motion, and held them, then let go. She found her workspace and set down the duffel. Outside, the sun had finished deciding and was now fully committed, burning the Nevada morning flat and white and unrelenting. The shooting range behind the far fence had started up. Single shots at first, then pairs, then the longer, deliberate rhythm of someone working on distance. She sat down at the desk and opened the first file. She had been in the room for 11 minutes when the work started feeling like the right kind of quiet. Lena Harmon had arrived at Fort Holloway on a Wednesday. By Friday morning, she had mapped the base thoroughly enough that she could navigate it blindfolded, identified 7 structural inefficiencies in the logistics reporting system that no one had bothered to correct, and developed a precise read on the social architecture of the place that confirmed what she had sensed on day 1. The current running beneath everything had Voss as its source. She watched him the way she had learned to watch things without appearing to watch, from across the mess hall, from the far end of the equipment corridor, from the window of her workspace overlooking the south end of the parade ground. She was not looking for confrontation. She was looking for pattern. 25 years had taught her that confrontation was almost never necessary if you understood the pattern early enough. The pattern was not complicated. Voss moved through Fort Holloway the way a weather front moves through a system, gathering pressure as it went, displacing the air ahead of it, leaving a particular stillness in its wake. He had 3 or 4 men who moved with him or near him on any given day, Mercer closest of all. He had an instinct for identifying people most likely to resist or report him, and a corresponding instinct for approaching those people in circumstances that made official reporting difficult. He had not yet approached her. She suspected that was about to change. Friday, 6:22 in the morning. She was crossing the north end of the parade ground with the duffel heading to the equipment checkout to sign for a vehicle. The sun was orange and low. The air still held the faint coolness that the desert releases at night and takes back by 8. She heard the boots before she saw him. Not the sound of someone walking toward a destination. The sound of someone walking toward a person. There is a difference, and the body registers it before the mind does a slight shift in rhythm, a weight to the impact that is less about progress and more about arrival. She kept her pace steady. He came in from her left, Mercer a half step behind and to the right. 2 other soldiers trailing at enough distance to be present without being formally part of whatever was about to happen. Hey! His voice was a sound that had learned the exact register of something that was not a greeting. She stopped. She turned toward him with the neutrality she had developed. Not friendly, not hostile, simply present in the way of someone who has stopped assigning energy to things before they're necessary. Morning, Sergeant. He looked at her the way some men look at things they have decided are less significant than them, with an attention designed to communicate dismissal, expecting the recipient to understand they were being measured and found minor. You must be lost, he said. This base isn't a daycare. Behind him, Mercer produced the small laugh he kept ready for these moments. The 2 trailing soldiers found something interesting to look at in the middle distance. Lena said nothing for a beat, not because she was intimidated, because she was making the calculation she always made: the space between what could be done and what needed to be done, and whether there was anything in that space worth occupying. I'm reporting to my workspace, Sergeant. Logistics support. He stepped closer. Not dramatically, just enough to reduce the distance by half, to put himself in the space that isn't shared with strangers. A territorial statement that didn't require words. Logistics, he repeated with the tone of someone naming something beneath them. You even know what post you're on. Fort Holloway, Nevada. She met his eyes. I know where I am. Do you? He took another half step. The morning light was behind him, and he was using it whether consciously or not to put his face in contrast in hers in clarity, an old technique absorbed by bodies that have spent years in rooms where power was a physical arrangement. Because what I see standing in front of me is someone who doesn't belong here. She kept her breathing even. 4 counts in, 7 hold, 8 out. She had learned the pattern in a classroom at Coronado 24 years ago, and it had never stopped being useful. I've been assigned here, Sergeant. If you have questions about my orders, Colonel Foster can address them. Something shifted in his expression. The casual contempt tightened into something with more edge, the expression of a man who has been in the habit of having the last word and has just heard someone indicate, without drama, that the last word might not be available. He stepped in again. Close now, the kind of close that is a statement. Rule number 1, he said, his voice lower, the performance dropped something colder underneath. When I talk, you don't answer back unless I ask you something. He let that sit for a moment. Then, and you don't walk around this base like you've earned something, because you haven't. Not here, not yet. From 30 meters away near the edge of the motor pool, a man stood with a cup of coffee and watched without appearing to watch. Captain Owen Drake. He had been at Fort Holloway for 14 months. He had 2 combat tours, a Silver Star from a position outside Fallujah in 2006 that he never brought up, and a reputation among the junior, enlisted for being exactly what he appeared to be, no more, no less. He was good at his job. He was fair. He had watched Voss operate for the better part of a year and had made a precise assessment of the situation and his own capacity to change it within the structure available to him. He had expected her to step back. She didn't step back. Drake set the coffee down. Voss was speaking again, now low enough that it wasn't carrying, but the shape of it was clear. The next step was contact. He was already moving when it happened. Voss's right hand reached out and closed around her left arm. His grip was not soft. It was the grip of a man who has grabbed people before and knows what it communicates: finality. The physical statement of a hierarchy he had decided was not up for discussion. You'll die now, he said. He meant it as a period. The last sentence of an exchange he had decided was over. He did not know, could not have known, because nothing visible in front of him suggested it, that the woman whose arm he was holding had spent the better part of 2 decades in circumstances where a grip on the arm was the moment a situation stopped being accessible and started being concluded. Her body moved before he finished the sentence. There was no wind-up, no preparation, no signal that anything was about to change. One moment she was standing with his hand on her arm. The next her foot had planted, her shoulder had shifted at an angle that seemed almost trivial, and the geometry of his grip, the leverage he had assumed was his, had become entirely hers. Her other hand found his elbow. Her hip rotated. 230 pounds of Sergeant Dale Voss left the ground. He hit it again with a sound that carried across the parade ground like a door slamming hard. The air came out of him in a single involuntary report. He lay on his back with his eyes wide and his chest working, and the Nevada sky directly above him, uninterested and very blue. The parade ground went quiet. Mercer had stopped moving at some point during the half-second that had reordered the morning. He stood with his mouth slightly open, holding a sequence of images that his brain was still working to assemble into something that made sequential sense. The two trailing soldiers were very still. Lena stood with her breathing unchanged, her stance open and settled, her expression that of someone who has done something unremarkable and is waiting to see what needs to happen next. She looked down at Voss. Then she reached into the duffel bag. The badge case was matte black. She set it on his chest with a precision that was almost gentle. He reached up with hands that were not entirely steady and opened it. The insignia inside was not something most people at Fort Holloway had encountered in person. Gold over black, the designation stamped below it in the font of official documentation that exists for things not placed under ordinary circumstances in front of a people. Commander Lena Harmon, SEAL Team Valor, Black Ops Division, 25 years active service. The silence spread outward. Soldiers who had been at the far end of the parade ground had stopped without being aware of stopping. Eyes that had been professionally elsewhere were no longer elsewhere. "You assaulted a superior officer," she said. Her voice was level, not loud. "That's your first mistake." A pause. "Your second was threatening my life." Voss's mouth opened. She had already picked up the duffel. She was 3 steps away when she said without turning, "Next time, learn who you're standing in front of." She kept walking. Drake was at the edge of the motor pool with his coffee when she passed. She didn't look at him. He didn't speak. But something shifted in his face as she moved past, not admiration exactly, and not the expression of someone who has witnessed something unexpected. It was more specific than that. It was the expression of someone recalibrating a question they had not realized they had been asking. He watched her cross the parade ground. She held that for as long as she could have held it, he thought. She waited until she had no choice. A person with something to prove doesn't wait, doesn't absorb the first 2 steps, doesn't stand still with someone else's hand on their arm and breathe like they have nowhere to be. He filed it, said nothing. Colonel Foster was at his office window when it happened. He had not been watching the parade grounds specifically, but the sound of impact carries across parade grounds in a way that 40 years in uniform had made involuntary. His eyes moved to the source before he had consciously decided to look. He saw the badge case placed on Voss's chest. He watched Lena pick up the duffel and walk. He stood at the window for a moment after she was gone. James Harmon had been 22 years old the first time Foster saw him move. Fort Bragg, autumn of 1987. An exercise meant to last 3 days that had needed to be redesigned on the second morning because Harmon had completed everything ahead of it in a way so quiet and complete that the instructors had stood around the result of it and been for a moment collectively without language. He had never seen James Harmon throw the first punch. He had seen him finish things with a precision that was almost meditative when they required finishing. But the first move was always someone else's mistake. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and called the medical unit to let them know Voss was on his way. In the medical unit, Voss sat on an examination table with his right shoulder being assessed and his face arranged into the expression of someone absorbing a reversal of fortune their identity had not prepared them for. The joint was badly wrenched, angry in a way that would be present and specific for some time. The humiliation was worse. He had been put on the ground, in front of everyone, by someone half his size who had not raised her voice and who had, if his memory was serving him correctly, which he was not entirely certain it was, because the sequence had been so fast and so complete, not even looked particularly interested while doing it. Mercer stood near the door and said nothing. Voss was thinking in the way of men who have not been made to account for their behavior in a long time, that this was not over. He was correct about that. He was entirely wrong about what that meant. Across the base in the small office on the second floor, Lena Harmon sat at her desk. The duffel was against the wall. The dog tags were outside her collar, now resting on her chest. She held them for a moment with 2 fingers. Her father had been 31 years old when he died. She had been 22. Chief Petty Officer James Harmon had been killed in March of 1999 during an operation in Kunar province of Afghanistan in a location that had been assessed as secure. She had been 22 years old and a junior at Ohio State, and her mother had called her at 7 in the morning, and the line had been quiet for 3 seconds before the words came, and she had understood in those 3 seconds that her life had just separated into a before and an after. 6 months later, in September of 1999, she had walked into a Navy recruiting office and given them her name. The petty officer behind the desk had looked up. She had said, "I want SEAL training. Tell me what that requires." 25 years had followed from that sentence. She was not trying to be her father. She had never been trying to be her father. She was trying to be worthy of the things he had believed were worth being. There was a difference, and she understood it down to her bones. But the line between those two things required constant maintenance, and there were mornings like this one when Foster had said the thing he said, and she had stood for 3 seconds with her hand not quite touching the doorframe when the maintenance took everything she had. She let go of the tags. She opened the next file. Outside, the Nevada morning was fully committed, the desert heat building toward its first real intensity. The shooting range behind the far fence was running a full rotation. She recognized the rhythm of it from 30 years of standing next to it, single shots at distance, placed with the patience of someone who has made a permanent agreement with stillness. She did not look up from the file, but something in her, something that 25 years of operating in silence had made very small and very quiet, registered the sound and filed it. Someone on this base knew how to be still. She did not yet know who. She kept reading. The shooting range at Fort Holloway ran along the eastern fence line, separated from the rest of the base by a berm of compacted earth and a chain-link perimeter that had been there long enough to rust at the joints. It was not a prestigious facility. The target frames were old. The wind readings posted at the firing line were updated inconsistently and required, if you were serious about distance work, that you do your own math. Captain Owen Drake was always serious about distance work. He had been at the range since 540, working through a sequence he ran 3 times a week, a discipline he had maintained since his first deployment, when a sniper instructor at Dam Neck had told him that the difference between a shooter and a rifleman was not talent, was not even training, but was the accumulated weight of mornings spent alone on a line when there was no requirement to be there. He had never forgotten that. He was working at 400 meters when she arrived. He heard her before he saw her. Not the sound of someone who didn't know the range, but the sound of someone who knew it well enough not to announce themselves. The gait, the walk to the far end of the line, the pause before selecting a position that comes from someone reading the space rather than simply occupying it. He kept his eye on the target. Fired, reloaded. She was 3 positions down from him, setting up with an economy of motion he registered without turning his head. The rifle she signed out was standard. Her position behind it was not. It was the position of someone whose body had made a permanent agreement with the fundamentals long enough ago that they no longer needed to think about them. Weight distributed correctly, shoulder contact, precise, the slight forward lean that accounts for how desert air moves in the morning before the heat builds. He fired again. "You were at the parade ground Friday," he said. "Yes," she said. "I've been at this base 14 months. Watched Voss operate for 12 of them." He ran the bolt. "I've never seen anyone hold that long before they moved." She was quiet for a moment. Down the range, a target waited at 450 meters, patient as targets are. "There's always a moment when a situation is still a situation," she said. "The work is knowing when it stops being one." Drake lowered the rifle. He looked at her directly for the first time, not the reading he had run on the parade ground, done from a distance in motion. This was the look of someone genuinely interested in the answer to a question. "Why did you wait?" he asked. "Specifically, you could have moved at first contact." She considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "Moving early is a choice you can't take back," she said. "And I have a policy about choices I can't take back." He picked up his rifle. He thought about that for a while. They fired in parallel for 20 minutes without talking, the range holding them in the companionship of a shared discipline that needs no commentary. After the third sequence, Drake sat back on the bench and looked at the row of ventilated targets downrange. "You've been watching the base," he said. "I watch every space I work in." "I know. I've been watching you watch it." She looked at him, then briefly the way a person looks when they have partially assessed someone and found more there than they expected. "Captain Drake," she said. "Owen is fine." "It isn't yet," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough." He stood and began breaking down. "Voss doesn't process this quietly. He has people, and he's impulsive enough to do something that makes his situation worse. I've identified who moves with him," she said. 4 men, Mercer is the closest." Drake stopped and looked at her. "You've been here 4 days." "I know." He stood with the rifle case and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "The gym is empty between 1900 and 2000. Most evenings." He said it without inflection, as a fact available to anyone who had paid attention. He left without waiting for a response. She watched him go. Down the range, the target stood in the morning light, riddled and patient. She raised the rifle and fired the last round of the sequence. The shot landed center. She ran the bolt and set the rifle down and looked at the hole in the target, and something in her face that had been still for 4 days shifted slightly, not much, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking carefully, and then returned to still. She began breaking down her position. 2 days passed. Voss came back to duty on Monday with his shoulder taped and his expression arranged into something that was not quite neutral. He moved differently than before, not with less physical presence, but with a new quality to it. Something had been introduced into his system that it had not previously had to metabolize. The process was not going well. On Monday evening, returning the vehicle logs to the East filing room, Lena passed the back corridor of the East barracks. The door at the far end was closed. Voss's voice came through it, not loud, not the performance register she had cataloged on the parade ground, but the lower directional register of someone mapping out a sequence of steps. At least 2 other voices underneath his. She did not stop. She noted the quality of it and kept walking. She had heard that register before in different buildings, in different languages, and it always meant the same thing. Someone was planning to restore a condition they believed they were owed. The problem was that the condition had changed. The problem for Voss specifically was that he had not yet understood how completely. Tuesday, 1400 hours, the motor pool. The motor pool at Fort Holloway was a flat asphalted rectangle on the eastern edge of the base, bordered on 2 sides by equipment sheds and on a third by the fuel storage unit. It ran on the logic of mechanical work, direct practical, governed by systems that either work or don't. Lena was crossing the north end of it on her way back from a meeting with the logistics NCO when she heard the voice. Not words at first, the cadence. She stopped. Voss was near the central fuel station, and the geometry of it was immediately recognizable. Not the paired geometry of his usual operation, but something with more bodies, more lateral, spread the geometry of an accusation rather than a performance. He was standing in front of a young specialist, and the tone he was using had a different quality than what she had heard on the parade ground 4 days ago. That had been casual dominance. This was something with direction. He was accusing the specialist of sabotaging the primary transport vehicle. The accusation was nonsense. Lena could read that from 15 meters. She had spent 4 days inside the logistics system. The vehicle had been flagged for maintenance 2 days prior, the issue logged correctly, a hydraulic seal failure consistent with age and accumulated hours. There was no sabotage. There was equipment that had lived past its useful tolerance on a budget that wasn't adequate to the demand placed on it. The specialist, his name patch read, Cord, and he was perhaps 21 years old, had the expression of someone aware that the truth was not currently relevant. Behind Voss, 3 of his men had arranged themselves with the informality of people present in a supportive capacity they would have asked describe as coincidental. Lena set her folder on a nearby crate. She walked forward. Sergeant Voss. He turned. His face went through several things in rapid sequence: surprise, recalibration, the calculation of a man who has just seen the variable he was not accounting for walk into his equation. Stand down, she said. The motor pool went quiet in the way spaces go quiet when something enters them that reorders their physics. Voss looked at her for a long moment. The taped shoulder was visible above his collar. Something moved behind his eyes, something that had been building for 4 days, that had been sitting in the back room of the East Barracks, that had been metabolizing incorrectly and building heat. You think, he said slowly, that you can walk around this base like you own it. His voice had the quality of something no longer performing. The performance had been the earlier version, casual contempt volume for audiences. This was the thing underneath. This was what the performance had been built to manage. You put me on the ground, he said, in front of everyone. You ruined my career. Sergeant, her voice was level. This is not the time or the place. You did that, she said. I just confirmed it. Something broke in him. Not dramatically, there was no signal, no winding up. He simply crossed the distance between them with the speed of a large man who has decided there is nothing left to manage. She saw Drake moving from the far side of the motor pool the same moment Voss moved. She lifted one finger toward him, a small, precise gesture from someone who has calculated the next 4 seconds and needs the geometry to remain what it is. Drake stopped. Voss reached her. He grabbed with his good arm, telegraphing the way people telegraph when they have stopped thinking, when the body has taken over from the part that makes decisions. She was already moving before the grab landed, not away, not backward, but sideways, and through, using his mass rather than opposing it. She redirected him into the equipment stack on his left, the crates catching him across the torso and spilling around him in the percussion of industrial plastic on asphalt. He came up immediately, still moving. He was beyond reason, and she could see that, and she calculated it. He swung. She dropped under it and came up inside his reach and landed 3 strikes in a sequence with a clinical quality: the wrist, the knee, the solar plexus. Each placed with the precision of someone who has done this enough times that the geometry is automatic, who is not striking from anger or fear, but from the same detached competence that a craftsman brings to work that needs to be done correctly. He went down. This time he stayed down. The motor pool was very still. Lena stood over him. Her breathing had changed, not labored but present in a way it was not before, and her right hand had a slight shake in it that she registered and stilled. She was aware of Cord against the equipment, shut eyes wide. Of the 3 Voss men at their original positions, none of them having moved. Of Drake at the far edge of the space standing with his arms loose at his sides. Mercer had dropped his radio. She looked at the soldiers along the shed wall. "Let this be the end of it," she said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Rank is not a weapon. It is a responsibility. What you do with it is visible to everyone around you, whether you believe it is or not. She paused. Act accordingly. She turned to go, and that was when she heard the sound. Small, specific. The sound of glass. She stopped. She looked at the duffel bag she had set on the crate when she came in. The bag had been knocked by one of the falling equipment crates during the commotion. It was on the ground now at an angle it had not been before, and from inside it came the quiet that follows the sound of something breaking, not loud, not dramatic, the small finality of a thing that cannot be undone. She set the bag upright. She opened it. The photograph was 4 inches by 6 inches. She had carried it since 1999, since the week after Arlington, when her mother had pressed it into her hand outside the car and not said anything, and Lena had not needed her to. It showed her father in fatigues at the edge of a tarmac, somewhere the background did not identify, squinting slightly against the sun behind the camera. He looked the way he had always looked when she was still young enough to think that the way her father looked was simply the way certain men looked, without understanding that it was something built rather than given. The frame was wooden, old. The glass had cracked from corner to corner in a clean diagonal line. She held it in both hands for a moment. The crack was irreversible. The glass could be replaced. That was a practical problem with a practical solution. But the fact of the breaking was permanent. It had happened. It was now part of the object's history in a way that could be addressed but not removed. She looked at the photograph through the cracked glass. Her father looked back. She closed the bag. She was not aware of Drake having crossed the motor pool until she looked up and found him 3 feet away, standing with the stillness of a man who has decided to be present and nothing else. He was not looking at the bag. He was not looking at her hands. He was looking at her face with an attention that was neither intrusive nor absent. He said nothing. She said nothing. After a moment, she picked up the bag and walked out of the motor pool. Drake watched her go. Then he looked at Voss, who was being helped up by 2 of his men. He looked at Cord still against the shed wall. He looked at the place on the crate where the bag had been, and at the small amount of glass on the ground that had come through the zipper when it fell. He bent and picked up the broken piece of glass. He stood with it for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket. The mess hall at Fort Holloway ran dinner service from 1700 to 1830. Lena was not there for most of it. She came in at 1820, took a tray, chose a table at the far end of the room, away from the main traffic, and sat with her back to the wall the way she always sat. She was midway through a meal she was not tasting when Foster sat down across from her. He did not ask. He simply sat the way people sit who have earned the right not to ask, not through authority, but through having been somewhere long enough to understand when presence is the appropriate thing. He had a cup of coffee and nothing else. "The motor pool," he said. "It's handled," she said. "I know it is. That's not why I came over." She looked at him. "Fort Bragg," he said. "Autumn of 1987. Your father was 20 years old. I was 22. He looked at the middle distance. "We were in the same evaluation cycle. 3 days. They put 16 of us through and intended to pass 4. He finished the objective phase 11 hours ahead of the schedule. The instructors didn't know whether to be pleased or embarrassed." Lena set down her fork. "He never talked about that," she said. "He wouldn't have. That wasn't how he was built." Foster looked at her. "You didn't know him as a professional. You knew him as a father. Those are 2 different people who share a body." "I know that," she said. "I know you know it. I also know that knowing it and living inside it are different things." Outside the mess hall windows, the Nevada evening pulled the heat back into the sky and left behind it a cold that arrived fast and without apology. The lights of the base came on in sequence as the light failed. "Today at the motor pool," she said and stopped. Foster waited. "I had a photograph, my father." The frame broke in the commotion. She said it plainly, not asking for anything, simply placing it in the space between them as a fact. I made a promise to him, not about the photograph specifically, but about using what he taught me. When and how much and in what circumstances. A beat. I kept the photograph as a reminder of the promise, not the skill, the judgment. Foster was looking at her with the complete attention of someone who has stopped waiting for the point and is simply receiving what is being given. I don't know, she said, whether what I did today was consistent with the promise or a violation of it. I have the reasoning, and the reasoning is sound. But reasoning about a promise to your dead father is a particular kind of activity. It doesn't resolve cleanly. No, Foster said, it doesn't. He sat with it for a moment. James made a promise to me once, 1991, before his first deployment. He told me that if it ever came to a point where keeping a promise meant someone else paid for it, the promise was already broken, and the only honest thing was to acknowledge it and do what needed doing. He paused. He said that a promise you keep at the expense of the people around you is not a virtue. It's a debt you're asking them to pay. The mess hall moved around them, the tail end of dinner service trays and voices, and the institutional noise of a shared meal. Lena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, he should have told me that. He was going to. He had 20 years to do it. Foster set down the coffee. He ran out of time. She said nothing. He stood. He was halfway to the door when Drake came in, and the two men exchanged a glance that carried the shorthand of two people who know the same thing from different angles and have not discussed it. Foster continued out. Drake paused at the door, then crossed the mess hall and sat down in the chair Foster had just left. Lena looked at him. How long have you been skeptical, she said. Not a question, an observation stated as one. Since you arrived. He said it without apology. Reputation travels in front of people, and it's almost never accurate in either direction. I've seen 4 people arrive at this base in 14 months with substantial records, and all 4 of them were in practice less than the records suggested. I had no reason to believe you were different. And now, he was quiet for a moment, not forming a diplomatic answer, but being precise. You had 3 opportunities to end it early. The first engagement, the motor pool approach, the swing. Each time you waited until there was no honest option left. He looked at her directly. In 15 years of this work, I have never seen anyone with the kind of background the record suggests demonstrate that kind of restraint. Usually the people with the most capacity are quickest to use it. Because they can. She said nothing. You're the first one, he said, who made me revise my assessment without doing a single thing to make me revise it. She picked up her fork. The restraint isn't virtue, she said after a moment. I didn't say it was. It's cost. Every time you hold that long, you pay something. It doesn't get cheaper. She looked at him directly. Today in the motor pool, I paid something I didn't plan to pay, and I'm still doing the math on whether the payment was worth it. Drake reached into his jacket pocket and set the piece of glass on the table between them. The piece he had picked up from the motor pool floor. Small, clean edge catching the mess hall light. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said nothing. She picked up the piece of glass carefully and held it for a moment, and the expression on her face was not one that came from the moment, it came from years behind, the moment from the weight of a name and a promise and a father who had run out of time before he could finish the instruction. She set it carefully in the side pocket of her jacket. They sat through the remainder of dinner service without speaking, and the silence between them was the silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill the available space, a silence that takes time to arrive at and cannot be manufactured. Outside Fort Holloway settled into its night rhythms, and in a parking area near the main gate, a government sedan sat in the dark, its engine cooling its single occupant still at the wheel. General Marcus Webb had a habit of walking a base before he talked to anyone in it. Not an inspection walk, not the kind that announces itself gathering an escort and moving with the formality of authority, conducting a review. A different kind of walk early before the base had assembled into its official version of itself, before the faces were arranged and the paperwork was current, and the informal realities had been tucked into the spaces between what was visible and what was reported. He had been doing this for 31 years. The walks had shown him things that no briefing had ever shown him, because briefings were composed by people who knew he was coming, and a base at 5:30 in the morning did not know he was coming and was therefore simply itself. Fort Holloway at 5:30 on a Wednesday morning was a base in the condition of a place that has been stressed for a long time along a fault it has learned not to name. He felt it in the small things. The way the enlisted men moved near the East Barracks with an excess of deliberateness, the body language of people who have learned that occupying space without drawing attention is a survival skill. The way 2 NCOs outside the mess hall stopped their conversation when they saw him, not because they recognized him, He was in civilian clothes, but because they had developed the reflex of stopping when someone unfamiliar came close. He walked the motor pool. He walked the perimeter of the parade ground. He walked past the administrative building's exterior and looked up at the second floor where a single light was on behind a window at 5:38 in the morning. He stood looking at that light for a moment. Then he went back to the officers' quarters and put on his uniform. By the time Colonel Caldwell Foster was notified that General Webb had arrived the previous evening and was already on base, it was 0600, and Foster had approximately 45 minutes to prepare for whatever was coming. He used them with the efficiency of a man who has been preparing for this particular reckoning for longer than the 45 minutes would suggest. He pulled the full incident reports, both of them, the parade ground engagement and the motor pool. He did not edit them. He did not soften the language around Voss or reframe the initiating behavior or add the contextual language that exists specifically to make bad things look like complicated things. He printed them as they were and added his own summary at the top, a single paragraph that said what it said without qualification. He had been in the Army for 34 years. He had written honest reports and strategic reports and reports that were both, and he had learned across those 34 years that the honest ones were almost never the easiest and were almost always the ones he could live with. He put the reports in a folder and went to meet General Webb. The meeting was in Foster's office, and it ran for 50 minutes longer than Foster had expected, shorter than he had feared. Webb read the reports. He asked 4 questions, all specific, none leading. He asked about the timeline of Voss's behavior prior to this week. He asked about the reporting history, whether anything had been filed, whether the system had functioned as designed, or had developed the institutional habit of looking past what was inconvenient to process. Foster answered each question directly. Webb put the folder down and looked at it for a moment. "How long has Commander Harmon been on this base?" "6 days, Foster said. Webb looked up. 6 days, Foster confirmed. Webb sat back and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man doing a specific kind of arithmetic. Then he stood. "I want to see Voss," he said, "and then I want to see her, separately, in that order." He saw Voss at 0740 in the conference room adjacent to the administrative building. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Webb did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He laid out in plain language what the report showed and what they implied and what they added up to in terms of the relevant regulations and the expectations of the uniform. Voss said 2 things during those 11 minutes. The first was the opening of an explanation, the kind of sentence that begins with the implicit argument that the relevant facts are more complicated than they appear. Webb let him get 4 words into it, then without moving and without changing his tone, made clear that the complications had been considered and did not change the arithmetic. The second thing Voss said came at the end after Webb had laid out what was going to happen. He said it quietly and it was not an argument. It was, if you were listening for it, something else entirely. "I didn't know who she was," he said. Webb looked at him for a long moment. That, Webb said, was never the relevant question. He stood and left the room. At 0815, Lena was at her desk on the second floor when a knock came at her door. She had been there since 0530, and she was in the middle of a system analysis that had nothing to do with what was about to happen. "Come," she said. Webb entered alone, without an aide, without Foster, without the accessories of authority. That authority sometimes brings into rooms to announce itself. He closed the door and looked at the space, the desk, the files, the single lamp that had been on since before dawn, and then at her, and his assessment was visible in the way that careful assessments are sometimes visible on the faces of people who are no longer young enough to spend energy concealing them. She stood. "Sir," she said. "Sit down, Commander." He took the chair across from the desk. "I've read the incident reports." "Yes, sir. Both of them." "I've also read Foster's summary, which is the most honest document I have received from this base in the 14 months since I have been receiving documents from it." He paused. "That is not a criticism of Foster. It is a comment on an environment that made honesty a departure from the norm." She said nothing. "Sergeant Dale Voss is relieved of duty effective this morning," Webb said. "He will face a formal board. Corporal Mercer will receive counseling and a formal notation." He looked at her. "The 3 soldiers who were present at the motor pool are being reviewed individually." "Sir." She stopped, then continued. "Specialist Cord, the young soldier Voss was targeting in the motor pool. He did nothing wrong and the vehicle issue was a maintenance failure predating his assignment. I'd like that formally documented." "Already done," Webb said. "Foster pulled the maintenance logs this morning." A pause. "You had read those logs?" 4 days before the incident. He was quiet for a moment, moving from the procedural part of the conversation to the part that was not. He reached into the leather folder he had brought and set a document in front of her. It was not a performance. There was no ceremony to it. He simply set it on the desk between them, and she looked at it, and the words on the cover page were in the format of official documentation. The header, the classification marking the date of declassification, and below those the name. Chief Petty Officer James R. Harmon, United States Navy, SEAL Team 6, operational record, declassified pursuant to executive order, September 2019. She did not move. 4 counts in, 7 hold, 8 out. The pattern from the classroom at Coronado learned in the 6 months after Arlington, when the only thing that had kept her functional was the discipline of the body when the mind had nothing left to offer. She had used it before combat, before extractions, before the particular stillness required when everything around you is moving and the brought is to be the one thing that is not. She had never used it to prepare herself to read her father's name on a document. She used it now. The full record was classified at the time of his death, Webb said. Standard protocol for the operations he was running. The declassification happened 5 years ago. The notification process, which should have reached his family, did not reach his family because of an administrative failure in the records transfer following the 2019 reorganization. He paused. I became aware of this 3 weeks ago when I was reviewing the file in connection with your transfer. She put her hand flat on the document, not opening it, just placing her hand on it. Your father ran 11 operations between 1995 and 1999, Webb said. All classified. 3 are still partially redacted for reasons that remain active, but the operational summaries are available. The outcomes are documented. He paused. In 11 operations, he lost no personnel under his direct command. His mission completion rate was 100%. In a field with those numbers, that is not a statistical outcome. That is a character outcome. She looked up. He never received commendation for any of it, Webb said. The nature of the work precluded it at the time, and after 1999 there was no one left in the administrative chain with visibility into the full record and the standing to correct the omission. He looked at her steadily. I cannot give him what he is owed. That window is closed. But I can make sure you have what you are owed, which is the complete picture. Her face was not broken. It was not the face of someone falling apart. It was the face of someone receiving something very heavy and making the adjustments necessary to hold it correctly. A set of realignment, a decision made at the muscular level. Her eyes were clear and doing the work that eyes do when what is behind them is processing something too large for expression and has chosen instead integration. He never talked about the work, she said. He wouldn't have. I thought the quiet was modesty. It was also protocol, and it was also something personal. Some people carry certain things privately because they have decided that the privacy is part of the integrity. Talking about it changes it into something else. He paused. That's a reading of the record, not a personal acquaintance. But I've read his record carefully enough to have a sense of how he was built. Colonel Foster knew him, she said. I know. I read that too. Webb looked at the window, then back at her. There are people at this base who have been waiting in their different ways for someone who reminded them of what the work is supposed to look like. I don't think you came here for that purpose, but I think it happened anyway. She was quiet. Webb reached into the folder again. He placed a second document beside the first to transfer record. Recent. The header identified it as an internal reassignment document from 6 weeks prior. She looked at the name at the top. Captain Owen Drake. Captain Drake was originally assigned to Fort Holloway as part of a leadership evaluation program, Webb said. Standard rotation. He was scheduled to transfer out 3 months ago. He paused. He requested an extension. Twice. The second request came in the week after you were assigned here. She looked at the document. He didn't know you were coming, Webb said. The assignment wasn't public. He requested to stay before your name appeared on any roster accessible to his level. Another pause, measured and deliberate. I thought you should have the full picture of the people around you. She said nothing for a long moment. Why did he stay? She said finally. His written request cited unfinished operational observations at the base level, Webb said, which is accurate as far as it goes. But a man with Drake's record doesn't file for 2 extensions on a rotation he finds routine. Webb picked up the folder. Some questions answer themselves in time. I thought you should have the information before time does that work for you. She held both documents, her father's record and Drake's transfer request, without speaking. Webb stood. The Pentagon has requested an intelligence analysis unit to be embedded within operational bases in the Western region, he said. Analytical function, assessment, and prevention. No combat directive. He folded his hands. I have been asked to identify a commanding officer. The criteria are specific and the list of people who meet them is short. You're at the top. She looked at the documents on her desk. She thought about 25 years of work in dark places, of teams she had been part of and teams she had led, of the weight of being the person in the room responsible for bringing everyone else home, of 6 days at Fort Holloway, of a photograph with a cracked frame, of her father 20 years old at Fort Bragg in 1987 finishing an objective 11 hours ahead of schedule because that was simply what needed doing and never saying a word about it to anyone. "I accept, sir," she said. Webb nodded, once. The nod of a man who had expected this answer and was nonetheless satisfied to receive it. "One more thing." He reached into the folder again and set a third document on the desk. A single page. "Specialist Cord. I've recommended him for reassignment to a logistics analytics track. His aptitude scores indicate he's working significantly below his capacity in the current role." He paused. "I thought you'd want to know that something constructive came out of Tuesday." He picked up the folder. At the door, he stopped. "Your father's record includes a note from his final evaluation," he said, "written by his commanding officer in March of 1999. He did not look back at her. He looked at the door. It reads, "Harmon operates at the boundary of what is possible with a consistency that makes the boundary appear to be in the wrong place." A pause. "I thought you should have that too." He opened the door and walked out. The hallway took him. His footsteps faded toward the stairwell. She sat in the silence he left behind. She opened the file. She read. She read for a long time. There are things you learn about a parent when you are young that stay fixed in you at that scale. The scale at which a child perceives, which is enormous and immediate and personal. The parent as the organizing principle of the known world. And there are things you learn about a parent much later when you are adult enough to read a record, not as a child reading a father, but as a professional reading a peer that are a different kind of knowledge, not larger than the childhood knowledge, not more accurate, but from a different angle, an angle that allows you to see the outline of the person who existed before you knew them, who existed in the world doing their work independently of the role you knew them in. She read about operations she had never known existed. She read the names of the people he had worked with, the outcomes he had produced through the combination of preparation and judgment, and a kind of courage that does not announce itself. She read the note from 1995, 2 years before she was old enough to know what he did. She read the note from 1997, when she had been 19 and had argued with him over the phone about a decision she could no longer remember the content of. She read his commanding officer's final entry and heard beneath the institutional language the person she had spent her entire adult life trying to understand. She sat with it. After a long time, she closed the file. She placed the dog tags on top of it, not as ceremony, simply as the arrangement of things that belong near each other. She stood and went to the window. Below on the parade ground, a group of junior enlisted were running a formation drill. Their boots hit the asphalt in the imperfect unison of people still learning to move together. An NCO called the cadence from the side, steady patient, the voice of someone who understood that getting there was the work and not the destination. She watched for a while. Then she went back to her desk and opened the current file and continued working. Because the work was there and it needed doing, and this had always been underneath everything else, the animating logic of her life. She was still working when the knock came. She had not been keeping track of time, which was unusual for her. And when she looked up, the light through the window had changed. It was late afternoon now, past the flat white of midday, moving toward the longer angles that come before evening. The base had settled into the quiet between the morning's business and the evening's beginning. "Come," she said. Owen Drake opened the door. He was in his regular duty uniform, and he was carrying something in his right hand held at his side, not offered yet. He came in without hesitation and without performance, the walk of a man who has decided something and is simply enacting the decision. She looked at him. He crossed the room and set the object on the desk in front of her. It was the photograph, her father's photograph. The wooden frame had been repaired. She could see where the old joint had been separated and reset the wood. Cleaned and the edges realigned, the work of someone who knew how to work with their hands and had applied that knowledge with care. New glass, clear, clean, undistorted. The photograph inside was unchanged, her father at the edge of the tarmac, squinting into the light that was behind the camera, looking the way he had always looked. The crack was gone. She picked it up. She turned it over. On the back of the frame, barely visible, a line of very small letters had been scratched into the wood in the shorthand of someone who was not a craftsman, but wanted to leave something anyway. She held it close to the lamp. It read, "The frame is new. The photograph is unchanged. Both things can be true." She held the frame in both hands. She did not look up immediately, and Drake did not speak, and the room held both of them in a stillness that was not awkward. It was the stillness of a moment that is complete and does not need supplementing. When she did look up, his face was doing what his face did when he had made his calculations and was simply present with the outcome of them. He was not waiting for her to say something. He was not checking whether his gesture had landed correctly. He was simply there in the room, having done what he came to do. How, she said. There's a woodworking shop in the civilian maintenance building. Staff Sergeant Riley runs it Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He owed me a favor. A pause. The glass is from a replacement frame from the supply room, standard size. She looked at the photograph. The piece of glass from the motor pool floor, she said. You picked it up. Yes, you were going to give it back. I was going to see. He said it honestly. I wasn't sure what it was until I had it. Then I understood what it was, and I wasn't sure what to do with that. The repair seemed more useful than the return. She set the frame down carefully upright, facing her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Drake. General Webb offered me the intelligence analysis unit, she said. I heard, Foster told me this morning. I accepted it. He was quiet. The not surprise of someone who had thought carefully about what they knew of her and found the decision consistent with the full picture of it. It's the right assignment, he said. I need good people around it. She said it plainly without softening and without excess. People who ask the right questions. People who change their assessment when the evidence requires it. People who know how to be still on a firing line. He looked at her. Is that an offer, he said. It's an observation, she said, followed by the information that the position has a vacancy for a senior operational advisor. She picked up her pen and returned to the file. You have until end of week to think about it. Drake stood for a moment. Then without comment and without ceremony, he turned and walked to the door. He had his hand on the frame when he stopped. He did not look back. For the record, he said, I changed my assessment after the parade ground, not the motor pool. The motor pool confirmed it. But the change happened when you walked away from him and didn't look back to see if anyone had noticed. A pause. I thought you should know when it actually happened. She did not look up from the file, but something in her posture changed, a small shift, the adjustment of someone receiving information that was not necessary and was therefore in its unnecessariness more significant than necessary information generally is. I know, she said. He left. The hallway was quiet outside her door for a long moment, and then the sound of his footsteps moved down the stairs and the building settled back into its afternoon self. She looked at the photograph. Her father looked back through new glass and the repaired frame unchanged. She set the pen down. She sat with it, not processing it the way she processed information that arrived in files and systems and intelligence reports, but simply sitting with it the way you sit with things that don't require action, only acknowledgement. Her father had finished every objective he was given and then kept going until there was nothing left to do. He had done it without announcement and without recognition and without ever saying a word to her about any of it, and the record of it had sat behind encryption for 20 years visible to no one. And the work had been the work regardless of who was watching. She had spent 25 years doing the same thing. She understood now that this was not coincidence. It was not even inheritance exactly. It was more like a set of values transmitted not through conversation. He had run out of time for conversation, but through the way he had moved through the world. In the years she was watching him move through it before she was old enough to understand what she was watching. She reached for the phone. 2 rings. Lena, her mother's voice immediate, carrying the alertness of a woman who has answered this phone for 25 years, always prepared for it to be delivering news that it had not so far delivered. Where are you? Nevada, she said. Fort Holloway. A pause. I have my own office. A silence. The silence of a person recalibrating from prepared to relieved. Are you all right? Her mother said. She looked at the photograph, her father squinting into the light, the new glass, the repaired frame. The crack gone, the image continuous, both things true. Mom, she said, I'm okay. She sat with that for a moment, and her mother sat with it on her end, and the line between them held the quiet, the way lines hold quiet when the important thing has been said, and what remains is simply the being there. There's a file, Lena said finally. Dad's service record, classified. It was declassified 5 years ago, but there was an administrative error, and it never reached us. She paused. I have it now. Her mother was quiet for a long time. All of it, she said. All of it. Another silence longer. She could hear her mother's breathing across the line, steady, and then slightly unsteady, and then steady again, the sound of someone absorbing something they have been waiting a long time to absorb. Was it? Her mother started. Stopped. Started again. Was what he did, was it? Mom, she said, but it was everything you always knew it was. The line held them. Outside the window, Fort Holloway moved into its evening. The parade ground below had emptied. The formation had broken, and the soldiers had moved off in their individual directions, carrying the end of their duty day with them. The base was between things, now between the work of the day and the rest of the night, in the brief interval when a place is neither fully active nor fully quiet. She had always liked this interval. In the field, it was the most honest hour, the hour when the performance of the day had concluded, and the preparation for tomorrow had not yet begun, and what remained was simply what was there. She stayed on the phone with her mother for 19 minutes, which was longer than she had stayed on a personal call in years. They talked about the file. They talked about Arlington in the early spring of 1999. They talked about small things, the house, the neighbor's dog, a book her mother was reading, and the small things had a weight to them that small things only carry when the large things have been named and set down and made room for the small things to be what they actually are. When they said goodbye, her mother said, "He would have been so proud of you." She didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "I think he already was. I just couldn't read the record." She set the phone down. The lamp on the desk made a circle of light across the open files. The dog tag sat on top of her father's record. The repaired photograph stood beside the basing. The image unchanged behind new glass. On the far edge of the desk, Specialist Cord's reassignment recommendations sat in its thin folder. Something constructive out of Tuesday, as Webb had said. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. She had 2 hours of work remaining before she could call the day complete, and the work would not do itself, and she had always been the kind of person who stayed until the work was done. That had not changed. It was not going to change. But something in the texture of staying had shifted, not the discipline of it, not the commitment, but the quality of what she was staying for. She was no longer here because she had nowhere else to be. She was here because she had chosen to be here and the choice was hers. And she understood the difference between those two things in a way she had not fully understood it before the week began. She worked. The light outside changed. The desert night came in from the east the way it always did, quickly, completely, without ceremony, replacing the day with a dark that was very large and very clean. Fort Holloway went into its night rhythms. The base breathed in the dark. Somewhere behind the east fence line, the shooting range ran its final sequence of the day. Single shots, deliberate, patient, the sound of someone who had stayed past the required hour because the work was there and it needed doing. She recognized the rhythm. She did not look up, but she allowed herself, for exactly one moment, the acknowledgement of it. Then she returned to the file, and the lamp held its circle of light, and the photograph stood beside it unchanged and new at once. And outside, Fort Holloway held its ground against the Nevada dark, the way things hold their ground when they have finally found someone willing to stand in them correctly. The stars at this altitude, this distance from the city, were the kind of stars that require a certain kind of quiet to be visible. Tonight, Fort Holloway was quiet enough.